Good afternoon. This week, International Press Institute's, IPI's representatives are in Turkey to attend to journalist trials. IPI is a global network of editors, media executives, and journalists defending media freedom and the free flow of news. And my guests today are IPI Turkey Program Manager Oliver Kyrle.
Hello.
And a fellow journalist, Kari Huhta. He's writing for Finland's best-selling newspaper, and also he's a member of IPI's Finnish National Committee. Welcome, you two.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us today. I know you were at the trials, the courts this week. How was it? It's a general question, maybe. Was it a busy one again? Because, we have sometimes, so many court cases all in one day, and sometimes all the judges go to some places and we don't have any. How was your week?
For me, it was a very important way of understanding what is going on beyond the numbers. First of all, the Palace of Justice is a large, very ambitious and somewhat intimidating building. Once you walk in there, it seems that you don't really know what's going to happen next. The accused don't know how their cases are going to progress. When we went in, we didn't really know in the end which cases were really being tried that day, and I suspect even the attorneys and perhaps even the prosecutors don't always know what is going to happen next.
Very good observations, thank you. And Oliver, I know that you are making a program here for Turkey, and in collaboration with the Media and Law Studies Association, I think, and you come every quarterly, I don't know, to check and go into these trials and see what's going on, the cases of, especially, not only for the journalists maybe, but freedom of expression. So could you tell us a little bit more about this program?
I mean, we have a couple of programs currently in Turkey. The main program is we're monitoring the press freedom situation. We're monitoring the status of journalists in jail. We have currently counted, I think, 120 or 121 journalists who are currently in jail. We are trying to use that for advocacy purposes to raise awareness about the prosecution of journalists and the state of press freedom here. The main reason we're here today is to launch this report that we produced just over the last few weeks, which is the result of a press freedom mission, which we organised in September with 7 other press freedom organisations. And we had the chance to meet not only with journalists and press freedom organisations here in Turkey, but most importantly with the Constitutional Court, with the Supreme Court of Cassation, the Yargıtay, and the Justice Ministry. And it was an opportunity for us to have a sort of face-to-face dialogue with them about the performance of the Turkish judiciary and its ability or lack of ability to deliver justice for journalists in this country.
Yeah, before going into this report, because I think 11 days ago it has been published, isn't it?
Yep.
So it's a very recent one, and it covers, as you mentioned, a lot of aspects together, and maybe we could go some of them one by one. But I would like you to, elaborate a little bit more on your observations here about, because it was very. That's how you feel really when you go to that big building, and exactly. But you saw some of the fellow journalists. I think you have a chance to speak to them. And how do you feel about this?
We had a chance to follow 4 different trial processes, and they were very different from each other. In the trial of Can Dündar, for example, nothing happened, and because there is an exchange of documents taking place between Turkey and Germany, where Can Dündar is. Then in the end, we went to a trial where there were 6 journalists who were charged with insulting the state, not the president of the state. There, it was a court of first instance. There was a single judge and only the defense attorney there, and after a brief speech by him, She then, after a few minutes' pause, announced a sentence of 5 months to 5 of these accused. One didn't get a suspended sentence because of other charges. Now, this was interesting because, according to the lawyer, for similar offenses still some time ago, others had received 11 years of prison. And, of course, for these people, it was terribly fortunate that they got a suspended sentence and not 11 years in prison. But it indicates a randomness, almost an accidentalness. And it also seemed, with all the other things that we saw, that there is a political context around the trials that influences how they progress and also would seem to bear on the sentences.
Another very good remark, really. Then maybe we can, because you must be also pointing out these flaws or problems in your report. Shall we start like in a general overview of this specific report? Because you mentioned some of the parts of it. Maybe I can, how is the press freedom environment since the coup attempt? Because, after the coup attempt, things radically changed, and the government and the authorities argued that this was they had to do that.
Yeah.
But now, after some time, do you find anything different?
I think the first thing to say about that is that press freedom problems in Turkey did not start in July 2016. Yes, our report and our investigation was to try and investigate and understand the full extent of the judicial policing, if you like, of the media over the last 2 or 3 years, what the consequences are of the state of emergency, the huge dragnet that was spread around, in which so many journalists were caught up in the sort of the sort of overflow from the coups, to understand that. But one of the key points in the report is to say that was not day one, that was not day zero, that's not when it started. The problems with the press started many years before. The history of Turkey's gone through many different phases, we know that, so this is just one other phase. But the process of beginning to muzzle the press in this century started in the sort of early 2000s. Journalists, the country's been the biggest jail of journalists since, I think, 2011 or 2012. That's when there was a whole Ergenekon case and Oda TV cases. So there have been different phases. What we see today is the consequence of quite a carefully constructed strategy by the AKP government to, first of all, win over the press, then control the press, and then to prosecute those who have not fallen into line. And it's that element of prosecution that has been so extensive and so extraordinary in the sort of the headline figures. And underneath those headlines, there are extraordinary stories and complexities which are very hard for us to understand. But that was the main purpose of the report. It was also because it was a good, timely moment to visit, to review with the authorities about what had gone wrong and what they were going to do about it. So the response to our criticisms were based on 2 sort of pillars. The first was that the judicial system itself has suffered. We all know about the huge turnover of lawyers and judges. Over a third of them were also removed and mostly prosecuted. So there's a huge sort of influx of very junior judges who don't have the competence simply to do it. At the same time, there was a huge wave of new cases, inevitably, in that period, so the justice system was overloaded with this process. And the third point was that with the constitutional reforms in 2017, the politicization of the judiciary became accelerated massively when the selection process for the judicial panel that manages judges, which controls their disciplining, controls their careers, selects which judge sits on which cases, is directly appointed by the palace and by the parliament. So those are some of our major concerns. And on top of that, but none of that excuses what is very apparent, and that is that there has been a quite deliberate conflation of journalism with terrorism. When all the sort of dust settles and the sort of mist clears and the evidence that is provided set before the judges, and some journalists have been in court for sort of months and months, sometimes years before the evidence is provided, and that evidence is so often based solely on their journalism and simply does not stand up to any scrutiny. And even if at a later stage through the appeals court, sometimes these cases are acquitted, are overturned, hundreds of journalists have suffered extraordinarily during that period. And we're convinced that this is part of a quite deliberate abuse of the legal process to silence critical journalism.
I don't know if you would like to add anything on that, but I had a specific question. It's not related to report, but I mean, especially after a few years, let's say, because of the crackdown on journalists and all what Oliver mentioned throughout these years, as a journalist who is covering world news, so you must be, getting news from Turkey. I don't know if it's your day-to-day. Is there a change in the news that you get from Turkey? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, is there less news, or you don't, not in the context, or do you feel like that, anything?
I think the news about Turkey and from Turkey have a very high profile now, partly because of events in Syria, partly because of the upcoming NATO meeting of heads of state and government, which is preceded by a confrontation between Turkey and France and Turkey and the rest. Turkey is in the news in any number of ways. There aren't very many happy stories recently. Mm-hmm. At the same time, of course, I mean, there's a huge amount of sort of on the retail level, individual contact between Europe and Turkey. I think people know each other better than ever. It's not just tourism, it's travel, interest in culture and literature. This level is, I think, very good. And Turkey's position as a point of interest in Europe is well established. But the news is not happy. And I think that's one of the main changes, is that after years of expectations, there seems to be a mutual disenchantment. Mm-hmm. And I think what is happening in Turkey now, apart from that, is basically what is internally happening in Turkey. It is, apart from damaging Turkey's relations with the EU, I think that's secondary, really. What's happening in Turkey is damaging Turkey. Right. By damaging the credibility of its institutions, which is something that's vital for any country.
It's again interesting remark, and we have to, maybe ponder a little bit more about that. But Oliver, I know I just break the flow of our report going through, but I mean, I needed to ask that because while so many journalists are in this condition, and some of them are outside Turkey, some of them inside in jail, you mentioned 121 journalists, and also, and others under this, the randomness of what will happen to them related to that. Maybe could you a little bit tell us in your report, how do you see, how do you put the journalists this position in that sense? I mean, being a journalist in that sense, how do you, how their problems is in the report in that sense? I mean, because it's the political interference, everything.
Where to start or where to end on a question like that? I mean, look, you look at the headline figures of the numbers of journalists in jail, but beyond that, there are hundreds more who are facing different forms of prosecution. There are hundreds more who are convicted and carrying suspended sentences. Mentioned earlier the recent sentences of 5 months. They're suspended for 5 years. For 5 years, these journalists have to be very, very careful about what they do, what they publish, what they say. the risk of being charged again and then having to sort of sit out that sentence as well in jail. And what we see is a sort of revolving door of prosecutions. People will be prosecuted, they'll be detained, they'll be prosecuted, they'll be convicted, they will appeal, they might win that appeal, and then it'll go back to the lower courts, and the lower courts might reject that appeal, which is what's just happened in the Cimahuriyet case over just a week ago, when the lower courts rejected the appeal from the Supreme Court, which seems extraordinary, but that's it. If they do happen to win that acquittal, they then may find themselves facing new charges for the same crimes, or new charges for totally different crimes. And so there seems to be this sort of process of, even if a lot of those journalists, many have been freed, the whole community seems to be living under this cloud of pressure upon them, so that they are aware that any misstep could result in further legal proceedings. And we forget that we're rejoicing in the fact that the numbers of journalists in jail has fallen gradually over the last few months. It's from 135 or 40 down to 120, but that sort of normalises the situation. That's a real fear, and it was drawn to our attention earlier today, the question of defamation and insult. We forget how that has been used over the last 10 years to silence the press. There's some extraordinary statistic in this report that between 2014 and 17, over 12,000 cases were taken under Articles 299 and 301, I think that's them, against journalists in this country, and that's it's just 12,300 different cases, and there may be multiple cases against one journalist, or we don't know. It's impossible to follow that, but it means an entire community is suffering from the permanent fear of being persecuted, even if those cases are thrown out and meaningless. It's the whole process, and that's what's. We've forgotten about that. That's we almost look back onto those as the good days, and that's a danger, that we accept what has taken place as normal. It's not normal.
Yeah, that's a very good point, I suppose. But this normalization feeling, I mean, do you also feel that your reports, you are regularly publishing reports, and you're after these trials? Of course, I mean, that maybe we should do that, but do you feel that people are not much reading these reports? They are just, who are your audience?
Well, that's a very good question. We don't know. It's very hard for us to tell exactly what the impact is, but what is our strategy? Our strategy is to monitor and document and record the process. If you have that information at your fingertips, then you can speak with authority to the authorities here in Turkey, or with authority to other institutions, whether that's the United Nations or the OSCE. The European Union is clearly a sort of big focus for our advocacy, and you can explain to them in detail what has taken place. I mean, look, just 2 days ago we had great news of the release of İdris Aylık'ın.
Yes.
This was a case that we've been campaigning on for some time, and just 4 or 5 weeks ago, we, along with 10 other organisations, submitted a sort of third-party intervention in support of the case, or the appeal, to the European Court of Human Rights. And they're appealing to the European Court because his case has actually been before the Turkish Constitutional Court, but it's been ignored. So they failed to take it up and to review his prosecution and his conviction. And our role was to try to make the case that there is no domestic remedy for his case, because the European Court can only take up cases when all domestic remedies have been exhausted. And so normally they would say we cannot rule on this until the Constitutional Court has. But our role was to provide the information that's available in this report, that is thoroughly documented, and explain these are all the problems in the judicial system, and this is why the judicial system cannot be relied upon to provide justice. And we submitted that back in October. The European Court has to decide in the next few weeks whether or not it is able to rule on that case. And our interpretation of the release of İdris, absolutely out of the blue, totally unexpected, is that this was possibly a preemptive strategy on the part of the authorities to say to the court, we sorted it, it's fine, he's released. I mean, he's not been acquitted. He's been released on probation, as we understand it, and that he could be re-jailed again next month if the courts change their minds. But for us, that's a sign that my interpretation is that although the Turkish authorities would never ever admit it, I think they are sensitive to international opinion. Mm-hmm. They are aware of the importance of their relationships with Europe. We know that there is a turn and a change in their relationship, but neither side can walk away. There's a long-term relationship that has to be addressed, and it's in the interest of both those sides to make that work. And so, yes, I think there is an audience for what we do. We can work very hard for a very long time and not see any concrete results, and then suddenly you get small little victories like this, and that has an impact. We can see that has an impact.
Do you agree that there's Turkish authorities are sensitive in a way to the international criticism? Your observations again, I'm asking, and also with the EU, because Finland is also used to be.
He's an EU member.
Yeah, used to be Turkey's supporter, the best supporter maybe in all Europe, accession to European Union. So is it still so? Do you feel the same? I mean, do you think the Finland also lost hope, or do they really go on? Because I will ask you, your maybe the other responsibilities, but your observations, how do they feel about it?
First of all, about the question of whether the Turkish government is sensitive, I'm sure it is. These are very subtle and slow processes. There is an economic imperative. There may be those in the Turkish government who are more sensitive to that, and others who see ideology as something that trumps economic arguments. But I think the economic issues for Turkey do loom large. They loom large also for Europe. Turkey and Europe have extensive economic ties. As far as the Finnish role in promoting Turkey's EU membership and the beginning of the accession talks in 1999, I think that was a very important thing that happened. Of course, that was an accident of calendar. Finland happened to have the rotating presidency then, but there were also statesmen in Finland, like the president at that time, Martti Ahtisaari, who had a very strong idea of the strategic importance of this sort of an American idea, partially, the strategic importance of bringing Turkey into the European fold. I'm sure that has suffered. That doesn't mean that it has suffered that people don't want it as much as they did, but it's clear to anybody that the chances of progress at the moment are not very high. But I'm sure that they're still given an opportunity from the Turkish side and given a willingness on the EU side to advance Turkey's accession talks, to open chapters and so on. I'm sure there would be support in a number of countries, including Finland. In the end, though, I mean, as flattered as I am as a Finn, you're mentioning Finland. Finland is a small actor on this one.
Sure, I know, yeah.
But there would be support also in other countries. The will is there, but there's no perspective at the moment.
But Finland, Sweden, these countries in general support journalists and freedom of expression.
Absolutely.
And with the funds, and I will be coming to the other question regarding you always mentioning the responsibilities of European Union in your reports, and also the opportunities to support journalism and press freedom in Turkey. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
I mean, look, now's a really important moment to be able to influence the EU's policy or strategy towards Turkey, because we have a new parliament, we have a new commission, and because of that, we have a new opportunity to sort of reset the relationship, and that is what is taking place. There's lots of discussions going on about what will be the strategy or the policy for the next 5 years. And the EU's, the record over the last 5 years has been poor. I mean, and there's been a real sort of block there. And the question is, how do you unpick that? And in our discussions in the Parliament or with the Commission, it's clear that there are very divergent views. There are those who say we should have nothing to do with Erdogan's government, and that we should cut all ties and until they start, proper, serious reform. There are others who say that we should forget all about human rights. We've got an economic relationship, and that is what's the priority, and a security relationship and a migrant relationship, and that is a priority, and we should be able to deal with the authorities regardless of how they treat their own citizens. Our view, actually, it's not for us to have a view on what the EU should or should not do. That's their responsibility. But our view is that the EU should engage. It has to engage. There is no other sort of choice. And in doing so, it must continue to promote the values that the EU claim to underpin the European Union. For us, the European Union is not just a trading bloc. It has about fundamental democratic values, which is as important to us as European citizens and members and citizens of member states of the EU, that the EU promotes citizens' rights for our own interest as much as it is for the interests of our colleagues in the neighbourhood. Of course, as an international organisation, we're interested in Turkey because we're a global organisation that promotes journalists' rights globally, regardless of whether it has a relationship with the EU or not. But I do think there's an opportunity for us to intervene and to remind the EU of their obligations. And this is crucial, I think, for the long-term relationship, even if in the short term opportunities seem very small. In the long term, everything can change, and to be able to demonstrate a continued commitment to our values is essential, I think, for our partners here in Turkey that we work with on a daily basis.
Yeah. And I think we would like that. But the atmosphere in general in the world, I think, is not good. I mean, the tides are not on our side.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And also, for example, a recent case in Malta, a journalist was killed, and also, I don't know, in Turkey's
Slovakia.
environment, yeah. Also in Turkey's environment, I mean, the near countries, I mean, for example, in Iraq, things are getting, similar things happening. I know we always think in Turkey that we are better in many of our rights from Iraq, but I don't think so, especially recently, because I think they are even catching up with us in the bad things, because there was a recent report about, the Communications and Media Commission. The Iraq's media regulator just decided to close down television broadcasters because of the recent protests, and this is, I think, they are getting from us, which we are very good at it. I was saying, I would like to ask that, would that make the public, maybe the journalists, to be much more responsible about these organizations? I know it's different. The journalists do they aware of that their profession now is under threat everywhere? And secondly, is the public seeing what's going on around the world, or it's just half-half?
There's never a 100% hit of the public. You get a sector of the public. It's a long process. But on the whole, I would say that the case for Turkey is easy to make. Turkey is an important country. The Turkish media scene has been rich. There have been high-quality media here. The newspapers of reference for international sources that if you get in Turkish or translated, Hürriyet, Cumhuriyet, Milliyet, the names are known widely. There's also here a tradition of very colorful scandal and entertainment-oriented media and sort of media that does not strive for objectivity. But what country doesn't have that? These don't exclude each other. That for people who produce quality media, that's simply a fact that exists, which makes it all the more important to produce quality media. And now that quality media in Turkey is under systemic attack. It's not being threatened by individual sort of short-term developments that may come and go. Although, as I said, there is sort of an atmospheric cycle to it, apparently. It's under systemic attack, and there seems to be an attempt to replace what is the Turkish high tradition of quality media with another system. of a government-directed media system, and I think that's extremely detrimental to Turkey, and it's destructive of a tradition, a great tradition of journalism that Turkey has been able to build, for Turks to use. And I think saying that to a European audience is a clear argument and helps you really to get the case across.
Maybe I couldn't express myself very well, because I think what you say is very relevant and very good, but I was trying to understand whether in the general deteriorating media atmosphere in the world, in Europe, I mean, how do public, are they aware of it? I mean, that was my question. I mean, how much they are aware of they are losing a very, very fundamental right, which is to get information, objective information?
That's a very good question. In a number of countries where alternatives to journalism are presented as journalism, which they're not, which are fabricated information that is as directed to appeal to an emotional reaction and to substitute journalism. And this is something that has received the most attention in the US because it has most financing in the US, but you have it in a number of countries. At the moment, I would say that the picture is mixed, where on one side, the circulation, although with all the technological change, circulation is a difficult number these days, but the audiences of quality media have actually grown because people are in need of information. And one shouldn't really underestimate the ability of the public in the long term to tell the difference when they're being lied to and when they're not being systemically lied to.
Thank you. And from then, maybe you could take how would your organization also would like to support Turkish journalism? Because I know it's a very consuming job to come to the trials and document them, which is very important, even if the audience is not aware or there's no big audience. But other ways, what do you suggest, or what do you have, as IPI, International Press Freedom, how the Turkish journalists could be more aware of your work?
Yeah, I mean, primarily we're there, first of all, to give support to our members in Turkey. When they are prosecuted, when they are jailed, we're there to give support and provide solidarity, to give voice to their concerns. We're also there to help them solve some of these questions that we're talking about. If you put aside the whole sort of judicial threats to journalism, there's another crisis of the future of journalism itself that Kari's already touched upon. The question of fake news, the question of the sort of economic future, the question of training of journalists. And one of the things that we think is important is that, I think that journalism has a very exciting future. We're going through a very exciting transition. Nobody quite knows what it's going to look like, but I absolutely agree with the point that it depends on the public's recognition of the crisis and the public's readiness actually to pay for journalism. And we do see that the public is increasingly aware of the importance of quality journalism, and it's partly about the profession rediscovering that. And then I think there is a quality. So I think what we are doing in Turkey is that we've got a sort of short-term strategy, which is all the campaigning and advocacy around what is taking place today. But there's also going to be a longer-term discussion about what journalism will emerge from this crisis. The AKP won't be in power forever. We know how you look at the history of Turkey, and things can change very rapidly, very quickly, and when that opportunity comes along, journalism needs to have a basis from which to regrow. And when we meet with journalists here, when we see that, first of all, incredibly brave journalists, incredibly talented and committed journalists, we wonder how it is that they are able to continue to commit themselves to the work that they do. And it's really inspiring what we find here. And we think that some of the solutions to the problems that we're experiencing in other countries, some of them will be found here.
So it's very exciting to hear that, because we sometimes, when we protest or try to defend our colleagues, we say journalism is dead, is dying. It's not, is it?
No.
This is.
It's just a saying, I know.
Theatre's dead, literature's dead. the movies are dead, journalism is dead, you know. People have a need to seek drama, and people feel a little desperate, perhaps. And so it's understandable the statements like that are made, but the resilience and the perseverance of journalism is amazing. You shouldn't underestimate it.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for this interview, for your time. And we'll be seeing you, I think, hopefully, in the coming months and days. Thank you very much for watching us.
Okay, thank you.